In 1767, the British had just upset the colonists yet again. Some colonists had gotten upset by the crackdowns on smuggling in 1763. Some had gotten upset by the Proclamation Line of 1763. Most colonists are going to be upset with the Stamp Act of 1765, but these various protests, boycotts, this type of thing, had forced Parliament to back down and repeal the Stamp Act. Well, colonists are going to be upset yet again in 1767 when the head of Parliament, the guy named Charles Townshend, will repeal, even though the Stamp Act was repealed, he's going to implement these Townshend duties or Townshend Acts, which are going to make it put higher duties on items like lead, tea, and paint. So the one on tea is going to be particularly upsetting to the colonists because they can't produce tea in the colonies. Just the environment's not good for it. So now this tea is going, price on tea is going to dramatically increase, and we'll see the same reactions we saw to the Stamp Act happen as a result of these Townshend duties, in spite of the fact that these are duties, which means again that the British had done these prior to 1763, but the colonists are basically going to say, all right, they're trying to trick us, they're trying to take money out of our pocket yet again. It's so soon after the Stamp Act it hits this raw nerve, and you see the same thing, elites encouraging protests, attacks on duty collectors this time, where it had been stamp tax collectors before, and you're going to see even violence against stamp duty collectors. And things are going to be particularly bad in New England, this enlightened area where everybody's hopped up on enlightened literature, and it's a place where there's a lot of commerce going in and out. So a lot of imports and exports. So this is going to hurt people's bottom lines, particularly up here in New England. It's particularly New England elites. Now, as a reaction to the Townshend duties, we'll see an increase in smuggling. They'll come up with sort of creative ways to get around the British trying to stop smuggling. But the big thing we're going to happen up here in New England is we're going to see these protests continue even after 1768, when the British are going to send soldiers to Boston to tamp down on the violence that's happening there. So as a result of the Townshend duties, we'd seen attacks on the customs house, we'd seen attacks on duty collectors, and things are really bad up there. There's even organizations we're not going to get to talk about, like the Sons of Liberty, where people start talking about possibly declaring independence against Britain. I want to point out in 1768, almost no one is talking about independence from Britain. You go up and down the colonies, vast majority of people would say that's crazy talk. Now, there is going to be a higher percentage of people in Boston, again, more Enlightenment literature up here, more people upset with the British. But even in Boston, even in the Massachusetts area, the majority of people would think independence is ridiculous, but they don't like what the British are doing, and they're going to be especially upset in 1768 when the British land troops in Boston. Now, this might not seem like a big deal to you, and it might not seem like a big deal because the troops that are landing are these British Redcoats that kind of look comical. They have these silly red clothes on. They start marching on the streets. They start stationing themselves outside of the customs house, protecting duty collectors. Might not seem like a big deal because their uniforms are dumb. But if you can imagine a scenario where today, what if the army started going down your neighborhood? What if you started seeing tanks go down your neighborhood? People with full body armor, Kevlar body armor, helmets and stuff. That's kind of scary. If anybody's ever played Last of Us, the scenario you begin with, at the beginning of the game where there are tanks everywhere. You have these soldiers with guns, and it's sort of military rule. That's what some of these people in Boston are going to be looking at this as. They're not seeing the comical thing we might see today. They're seeing a soldier that's scary. This is somebody ruling through physical violence or the threat of physical violence, which isn't something the people of Boston are used to. Again, we've had these fairly representative colonial assemblies making the decisions, but now it's looking like the king and parliament have just stuck soldiers in their region, and they have just stuck soldiers. But the reaction in Boston isn't going to be the one that Parliament and the king are going to expect when soldiers land. Instead of backing away from protest, there's actually going to be an increase in protests to the presence of the soldiers. When the soldiers are standing outside the customs house, people will walk by, yell names at them. Hey, lobsterback. Hey, jerk. I don't know if they said jerk. They really did call them lobsterbacks, though. But they'll start calling them these various names. Soldiers will be walking along the street, escorting duty collectors, and people will insult them. This isn't what the British Parliament had expected when this happened. And the protests are going to go on through 1768 into 1769, and they're going to get really bad in 1770. What's going to happen in early 1770 is a group of soldiers will be sent to guard the customs house. This is a duty they had normally had. Basically, all the money collected by duty collectors will be brought to the customs house, and soldiers outside will guard the customs duty collectors while they do their work. It's just a sort of measure put in place following the Townsend duties. So these soldiers are outside this customs house when a mob of protesters are going to form. Basically, elites in Boston. This is kind of an interesting part of history, but basically, elites will set up a protest outside the customs house. They'll encourage people to protest the British, protest the presence of the soldiers, and this mob will form around the soldiers of hundreds of people. And there's only going to be a handful of soldiers outside the customs house. I think 8, something like that, are outside the customs house, and these are mostly young kids. So the British Redcoats, they come straight from Britain. Usually, a lot of times, poorer kids, they'll sign up for a couple years of service. And when you sign up for service, you could be deployed anywhere in the British Empire. You just happen to be deployed here to Boston. Well, back in England, Boston area and Massachusetts area and just New England in general has this reputation of religious fanaticism. They still think they're Puritans. As we've talked about, that fanatical Puritanism, for the most part, has died out. But you're sent to this area where you're told these religious fanatics are, and you get there, and you start seeing insults day in and day out. And then this one particular day in 1770, you're starting to get a crowd around you yelling, calling you names. Eventually, some people in the crowd are going to start throwing snowballs at you. You're a young kid. Let's say you're 19 years old. You're surrounded by hundreds of people, and now people are throwing snowballs. And then they're going to start throwing rocks. What they'll do is they'll start wrapping snow around rocks, chunking it at you. But then it's just going to go to straight up rocks, like heavy rocks. As a matter of fact, somebody from the crowd is going to throw a heavy rock, hit your fellow soldier right beside you in the head. Blood's going to start gushing out of his head. He falls to the ground. So you're surrounded by these people. They're calling you all sorts of names, and some of them even saying, "Fire, damn you, fire." And they're just going to be threatening you in all sorts of imaginable ways. How much you respond to that if you're just young redcoat, you just seen one of your companions hit with a rock, what might you do? Well, what the British surrounding this customs house are going to decide to do is they're going to decide to fire into the crowd. So they're going to disperse the mob by firing back at them. They're going to claim, and I think it's legitimate, that they thought their lives were threatened, and so they had no response but to fire into the crowd. When they fire into the crowd, they're going to kill 5 people. 5 people in the crowd. And now we have 5 colonists dead. So up to this point, we've just had protests. We've just had boycotts, colonists unhappy about the Stamp Act, Townsend duties, things like that. It was almost, it's not fun, I don't want to say, but it was, it wasn't anything costing lives. Again, you had tarring and feathering, but, nobody had died from that. But now here in 1770, shit gets real. Shit gets real with this Boston Massacre. You have 5 people dead. Now, the term massacre might not seem appropriate for 5 people. The term massacre is going to be thrown on by the colonists, and especially, Boston media basically saying, look what these guys just did. They massacred our people. Now, your government is killing your people. But even some of the media is going to look at this situation and see some nuance involved and say, maybe we're pushing them too far with the protests. So some of the colonists are going to say, maybe we should start backing down a little bit here. Like maybe we're pushing too far too fast. Um, at the same time, the British, and particularly British Parliament, are going to say maybe we're pushing these guys too much. Maybe we're trying to extract too much out of them. Maybe we're pushing them towards revolution. Again, at this point, 1770, even after this happens, very small percentage of people are talking about independence. But Parliament's cognizant that if they keep pushing, then eventually they get to the point where these colonists might want independence. So, what Parliament will decide as a result of this Boston Massacre is we need to calm down a little bit. And those pushing the rhetoric of protest, they're going to calm down on the colonist side. Parliament's going to say we need to calm down as well. One thing they're going to do is they're going to remove the troops from Boston. We think this is inciting crowds instead of keeping them calm. We're taking them out of there. All right. Parliament will allow 8 of the soldiers' presence around the customs house to be put on trial. So they're going to stand trial in a court in Boston. They're going to stand trial. 6 of the men will be acquitted. 2 are going to be convicted of manslaughter. The person that's actually going to defend the soldiers is future vice president John Adams. So they let them stand trial. The 2 that acquitted, they get branded on their hands. All right, so same time, Parliament's also going to repeal all of the Townshend Acts except for the one on tea. So the one on lead, paint, paper, we're repealing those. We're pushing these guys too far. So think about this Boston Massacre in 1770 is stuff gets real, and both sides are going to say, I don't know if we want this to get just real just yet, and they're both going to pull back. Again, colonists slow down the protests. The British repeal all the Townshend Acts except for the one on tea, pull the troops out of Boston, all right, and allow the soldiers to stand trial. Okay, well, from 1770 to 1773, it's almost going to be a period of peace. Both sides realize I'm not going to be pushing things. There's not any protests, and there's not any protests because from 1770 to 1773, Parliament doesn't do anything else. Again, they realize kind of made a mistake with all these Townshend duties, so they're not going to push the colonists by trying to tax again or adding additional duties. So there's going to be a period of relative peace from 1770 to 1773. Well, in 1773, Parliament will pass something called the Tea Act that's going to end up inciting violence on the hands of colonists again. And this is going to be unintentional because Parliament's going to pass this Tea Act when thinking that the colonists will not react the way they're going to react. As a matter of fact, Parliament thinks the colonists will give a thumbs up to the Tea Act. What the Tea Act is it's not even something that directly affects the colonists. The main purpose of it is to help out a British company called the British East India Company. So if you are a company formed in Britain, basically you have to get a license from Parliament to conduct business in Britain's overseas colonies. One of the major British companies was something called the British East India Company. And what the British East India Company did was they got a license from Parliament to grow tea in East India, so India over here, which the British had colonized previous century. They would grow tea here, and they would export this tea to Britain alone. All right, a different area of different company is the one that exported tea to the colonies. Although most colonists are getting their tea illegally from Dutch smugglers at this point. But this doesn't affect the British East India Company because prior to 1773, they just sold their tea exclusively to England, just Britain, UK, or whatever. They just sold it over here. And so what the British East India Company did was they had these tea plantations where they would have Indian workers pick these tea leaves from these tea trees. They would then dry them out. They would then pack the tea into these boxes, process it, and load it on board these ships. These ships would then take it from India, and they would bring it back to England, where they would be stored in these warehouses in London, and then merchants would buy them and sell them exclusively in England. It's just a company that was licensed to sell in Britain alone. Nothing to do with the colonies prior to 1773. Well, the British East India Company is going to have a problem in 1773. They had a particularly good harvest of tea in the early 1770s, and they produced a lot more tea leaves than they had in previous years, which seems like a good problem to have. But the problem is they are going to have a surplus of tea. So they grew so much tea, shipped so much back here to Britain, that their warehouses are going to be full of tea. The supply outweighs the demand. And this is going to be a problem because if you let tea sit around, especially in these old-timey warehouses, it can get moldy, it can, get moisture and essentially get ruined. So the British East India Company is going to lose a lot of their tea unless they sell it, but they can't sell it because just about everybody in Britain has enough tea. And even if they lower the price on tea to extremely low prices, which they already have, people simply aren't going to buy it because they have enough tea. They have a surplus of it. The demand isn't there. So the British East India Company is in a position where they're just going to lose this tea. Nobody's buying it. We have warehouses full of this stuff. Well, British East India Company will go to Parliament in 1773 and say, dudes, can you help us out? Can you help us get rid of some of this tea? Well, Parliament's going to look at this situation and they're going to come up with an idea. What if we allow the British East India Company to sell to our North American colonies? They have so much of the stuff that if they bring it over here, they're going to sell it for extremely cheap. Again, if they don't sell it, it's going to rot. So if they bring it over here, I'm making up the price. They'll sell it 10 cents for what would normally be $1. And what the Parliament is thinking is, this will be great for the company because at least they're making a little bit of money where they otherwise would lose it. Parliament thinks it's going to be great for them because they still have the Townsend duty on tea. So once the tea gets in here, even after the duty's collected, it's still going to be sold for extremely cheap. So we'll get the money off the duty. British East India Company will make at least some money from it. And even with the duty added, once the tea hits the shelves, it's going to be so cheap, the colonists aren't going to be upset because it's way cheaper than they got it even before this duty was applied. So Parliament thinks of this as a win-win-win. British East India Company gets rid of tea, makes a little bit of money off of it. We get our duties paid so we can start paying back the debt we accrued in the 7 Years' War. Colonists get very cheap tea. Only one group really loses out in this Tea Act. Who might lose from it? Smugglers. Okay, so since the Tea Act had been implemented as part of the Townsend duties, these American smugglers had been smuggling tea out of the Dutch East Indies, bringing it to the colonies. This is going to undercut them significantly because, even people, if they, lead boycotts against this, there's going to still be people buying the extremely cheap tea. So these smugglers are going to be run out of business. They're the only ones that are really going to lose. And the colonists, they're going to think they're going to lose because they don't view this as a win-win-win. They don't view this as a measure to help the British East India Company. The way the colonists are going to view this Tea Act is as a trick. It's to drive our smugglers out of business, and then once they're out of business, the British are going to raise the price on tea, and we're going to have to pay this increased duty. This is an attempt to trick us. So what was meant to be a win-win-win, the colonists are going to take as a trick, and what we'll see in 1773 is the colonists are going to react to this fairly benign Tea Act with violence. They're going to start doing the exact same things they had done after first learning about the Townsend duties in 1767. They're going to start attacking duty collectors, tarring and feathering them again, and start protesting yet again. So I don't know if this actually happened, but this is sort of a tale that happened at the time. Not only would they tar and feather duty collectors following the Tea Act, supposedly there were instances where they would heat up tea, get it boiling, and then they would force the boiling tea down the duty collectors' mouths. Like, you're trying to force us to drink this. And this is going to happen throughout the colonies. We'll see people react with violence in this manner. Not only is there going to be violence, there's going to be boycotts. We'll see that people will start calling for boycotts of the British East India Company tea. Don't buy it. I don't care if it's cheap. We encourage people to continue to buy from smugglers. Don't give in to the British tricks. There's also going to be a series of tea parties throughout the colonies where some people illegally dump tea that has being brought in from this British East India Company into the colonies. And what we're going to see is that the tea parties, the protests, the violence is going to be most pronounced yet again here in Massachusetts, particularly New England as a whole, but particularly Massachusetts and specifically Boston. Again, Enlightenment. This is also an area where smugglers. There's a lot of smugglers. So the way they see this is again this British trick, and again you have a lot of people hopped up on Enlightenment literature that don't they don't particularly like the monarchy anyway. If you have any area of the United States that's talking about independence, it's this region. But again, even in 1773, as we'll see, there's that's sort of a minority of the population. But people don't like this Tea Act. They see it as a trick, a tax duty collector, stuff like that. Well, one way that the people of Boston are going to protest this is they're going to hold a massive tea party. And this is going to far out eclipse any other tea party in the colonies. What the people of Boston are going to do, and this is the Sons of Liberty organization, is you're going to see them meeting up in these smaller city councils throughout Massachusetts. So you'll have, a city here meet, a city here meet. And at these councils, you don't have a governor like you would at the Colonial Assembly monitoring things. And so at these councils, they're going to basically talk about how we should respond to it. And they're going to decide collectively that they should destroy the tea from the British East India Company when it gets into Boston Harbor. And as a result, we're going to have on December 16th, 1773, these various people from throughout Massachusetts, but particularly Boston, will go onto these ships that are arriving with this British East India Company tea. By the way, these aren't even British East India Company ships. These are just Joe Schmo ships that happen to be transporting this. But they're going to go onto these ships, and they're going to dump the tea in the harbor. We don't even want to give it a chance to be sold. We want to destroy it before it gets there. They're going to dump 90,000 pounds worth of tea. Now, I think that's 90,000 pounds, meaning that's how much in British pounds it's worth. It might actually also be 90,000 pounds of tea into Boston Harbor. So they dump this stuff in. There's a couple myths about this Boston Tea Party. One myth is that, Boston Harbor tastes like tea for a month after. Boston Harbor's really big. That part's not true. But some things that are true is they dump so much tea overboard that the tea actually rises above the waterline. There's so much dumped in there. Other things that are true about this, the colonists are going to dress like these Mohawk Indians, similar to the Iroquois. But these Mohawks, they would wear these feather headdresses and leather clothing. And this is sort of interesting that they choose Indians to dress as. But one of the things that you see happen is as Indians become less of a threat to the colonists, which by this point, Indians have been far away from Boston for generations. So it's probably been 2 generations since there had been an Indian attack. Grandpa maybe fought Indians. But as they become less of a threat, they almost become idealized in the minds of New Englanders. And they're sort of viewed as with how would you call this, reverence or something like that, like almost like we would view Indians today. You view them as when they cease to become a threat, then they become something to honor. And so the way the people of Boston had come to regard them is, they're free from certain trappings of civilization that we have to deal with. So they become representative of freedom. And this headdress, this Indian headdress, will actually become a representation of freedom during this time. Very unusual thing. But anyway, these guys dressed as Mohawk Indians, dump this tea overboard, this massive protest to this Tea Act. All right, a lot of tea, tons of property lost. All right. Well, King George is going to learn what has happened in Boston at the beginning of 1774. Word will arrive from the Americas that these people in Boston in particular are committing acts of violence against duty collectors. Now they've dumped a significant amount of tea in Boston Harbor. Now I want you to think about how King George might think about this in 1774. At this point, he's going to say, I fought that 7 Years' War for the colonies. I got rid of the French threat. I borrowed a lot of money from English citizens. our subjects. I borrowed money from them to defeat the French, drove them out. That costed a lot of money. I needed to pay it back. I tried to implement a stamp act to pay this thing back. These guys protested. They destroyed property outside of potential stamp tax collectors' homes. We repealed it. Then I tried to do these duties, which again they didn't. They said we're okay, we can do them. They said the stamp act. They didn't like the fact that it was a tax. But then we tried to do a duty, and they start protesting yet again. They start tarring and feathering my officials. And again, we repealed all of them after that Boston Massacre, all except the one on T, and sort of we back down yet again. Then we do this T Act, which again is not meant to trick them. It's sort of a win-win-win, and they respond by destroying the private property of my subjects. So the way King George is going to look at this is all that work that went into creating this tea. So the Indian laborers that picked it and dried it, the British merchants that transported it, either to British warehouses or later directly to the colonies, all this stuff, these traders that put their work into it, these guys just threw it overboard because they don't want to pay money into the system. You can almost view King George. Imagine today, if you had people in Alaska that started attacking postal service employees because they're government workers, decided we're not going to pay a tax or something like that, or pay certain duties. They refuse to do that, and they're committing violence against government officials. I mean, you might label them as terrorists, and that's essentially what King George is going to label the people of Boston. Now, he specifically thinks that Boston, and he's correct in this, is the heart of this protest movement. Now, people in other colonies aren't happy, but it's specifically in Boston where we've had most of the trouble. That's where the Boston Massacre was. That's where the attacks on duty collectors were most prominent following the Towns of Duties. And that's where things are going to be worse after the Tea Act. So the way George is going to look at this is these guys are spoiled brats. We need to punish Boston, and we need to punish Boston to a degree that we show these other colonies this is what happens if you continue to be jerks, okay? So Boston's the worst. We're going to punish them to show these other colonies, don't be jerks. This is what's going to happen to you if you do what Boston does. So in 1774, George and Parliament will pass something called the Coercive Laws. Now, the colonists are going to come to regard these as the intolerable acts. So they're called the Coercive Laws, and the Coercive Laws are going to be George. And by the way, George had largely stayed out of colonial affairs, let Parliament handle things up to this point, but 1774 he's going to say, Parliament, you're not doing enough. I'm going to punish these guys. I'm going to show them who's the boss. So what the Coercive Laws will do is they're going to put soldiers back in Boston. So they'd been removed following the Boston Massacre. We're putting them back in there. They're going to forbid town meetings. So a lot of the protests have been organized in these town halls outside of Boston. Those are forbidden. We're going to close Boston Harbor to all trade until this the money, the cost of the tea is repaid to the British East India Company. So this map doesn't show it, but you have all these smaller rivers flowing down into Boston Harbor. Anybody going into Boston Harbor, any trader that ships through Boston Harbor can no longer ship from Boston Harbor. And we're going to put British ships outside of Boston Harbor to prevent this from happening. So if you're somebody that would normally trade out of Boston, you're going to have to go to a different port. That might not seem like a big deal, but most of these people that, if you're going wheat or you're one of the industrialists in the area, if you want to bring your stuff to a different port to ship out of, that's a ton of additional cost. There go your profits. So we're shutting down Boston Harbor to trade until they can raise enough money to repay the British East India Company. So shut down town hall meetings in Massachusetts as a whole. So anything in Massachusetts, no town hall meetings unless a British official's present. So those things are shut down. Soldiers back in Boston. Boston Harbor is shut down until until the cost of the British East India Company's tea is paid back. Here's the big one. Here's the big thing of the coercive laws. They're going to essentially shut down the General Court of Massachusetts and make it to where the British governor does everything, makes all the decision for Massachusetts. So going all the way back to when the Puritans first settled Massachusetts, 1629, 1630, the General Court had been making decisions for the colonies. They've been the ones taxing, they've been the ones passing laws, doing infrastructure projects, that type of thing. That was handled in Massachusetts by this fairly representative government body. Now that's gone. You people of Massachusetts no longer going to make decisions for yourself. The governor's going to make decisions. So that shuts down this colonial assembly. So Boston Harbor, soldiers in Boston, no more town hall meetings, and essentially Britain takes direct control of Massachusetts. Again, if you're King George, this makes sense because these guys are jerks, and he thinks that he needs to set an example of them. But if you're somebody in Boston, your livelihood, I mean, you're not going to make any money because shipping out of a different port is going to cost you a lot of money. This is a cartoon from the time depicting the colonial reaction to it. That's going to cost you money. Soldiers back in Boston, this is using military force to get what the government wants. Military law. That's not something that people of the colonies are used to, and it's not something that people like, especially those hopped up on Enlightenment literature. Don't think that's the way things should be done. You see right here, Boston Port Bill. I'm not sure who these guys are, but I bet it's Spain and France sort of laughing at the situation. I bet this guy's meant to be a Spaniard, a Frenchman laughing at it. That's just a guess. This lady right here, this is Lady Justice. She's looking down at what's happening, and this is meant to depict Lady Liberty. So this is actually kind of interesting. She's got the Indian headdress meant to represent freedom, and she's having tea forced down her throats by these British officials. This British official, it's almost like a rape scene, like they're about to rape Lady Liberty with these intolerable acts. Again, coercive laws, colonists will call them intolerable acts. Lady Liberty, Lady Justice can't look at what's about to happen to Liberty. Basically, the British forcing this bitter drought down Lady Liberty's throat. So this is going to obviously upset people in Boston. There's going to be furious about it. Before the arrival of the British soldiers, there'll be a series of protests about it. But it's not just going to upset Massachusetts. It'll upset other colonies, particularly this neighboring colonies, and again, these Puritan, hopped up on Enlightenment literature colonies. But it's going to even go beyond New England. So people here, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, they'll start saying, dude, that's messed up. Colonial Assembly officials in South Carolina, North Carolina, that could happen to us next. Colonial officials in the House of Burgesses in Virginia, if the king can just remove their government, couldn't they remove our government as well and force us to accept direct rule? So throughout the colonies, a lot of people are going to react to this and say, we need to respond to this. This is not something we can tolerate. So what you'll see in 1774 as a response to the Intolerable Acts is that all these elites in these various colonies are going to call one another up again. Again, not call, but hey, Steve in North Carolina, it's Joe in Virginia. Do you hear what happened up here in Massachusetts? Dude, that's effed up. Yeah, I did. Call up your buddy Tom in New Jersey and see what he thinks. I can't believe that's happening. That's crazy. What if that happens to us next? Call up Joe in New Hampshire. Dude, I'm here. I got a buddy down there in Boston. He says it's wild ass down there. We've got to do something about that. So what each of the colonies are going to do is they're going to decide to meet yet again. So they had the first meeting at the Stamp Act Congress. They're going to meet yet again. This time it's going to be in Philadelphia. They're going to pick a place roughly halfway in between. And elites from each of the colonies will be sent to meet for this first Continental Congress. So we're going to decide to do what we did after the Stamp Act and respond collectively as colonies to what's happening in Massachusetts. So these officials from the various colonies, and I shouldn't say officials, these are just elites, newspaper owners, some colonial assembly officials, just some wealthy people. Again, using the example I used before, Mark Cuban, Beyonce, I don't even know, AOC. You will have some politicians. Heck, I don't know, just random wealthy people, lawyers, politicians, would be meeting in this area to discuss how to react to the British. Well, at this first Continental Congress, you will get guys like Virginia's going to send George Washington, this former, this wealthy dude, former guy that fought in the French, or sorry, the 7 Years' War, and these guys are going to meet, and they're going to decide how do we respond to this. When they get there, there's going to be one group of people saying, "We got to go to war. We got to fight for independence." These are the guys from Massachusetts and a couple people from other areas of New England. But in 1774, the rest of the guys are like, what the hell are you talking about? War? What are you talking about? Independence? This is an idea that most of these guys think is ridiculous in 1774. They don't like what the British did to Massachusetts, but very few people are calling for independence at this point. These guys are just meeting to decide how to respond. Very few are considering anything about independence. They just don't like what Britain's doing, and basically they want to go back to the way things were in 1763 and before. So when these guys meet, some people call for war, but very few do. Very few are going to say that. Dude, slow down. Slow down. That's ridiculous. But we do need to do something. So they're going to decide to use their influence and go back to their colonies, and everybody's going to call for a boycott of all English goods, stop exporting American goods to Britain, stop buying British goods. Same thing they'd done after the Stamp Act. We're going to do that again in protest. Another thing these guys are going to decide to do is to write a mean letter to King George. So the First Continental Congress, they're going to write this mean letter that basically says, "We, the colonists, have a right to life, liberty, and property, and we feel that you're impinging upon that with these coercive laws. What you're doing to the people of Massachusetts is wrong." And basically this mean letter will make demands of the king. They'll, it's not exactly like this, but imagine it like, "King George, you're a jerk. You're hurting Massachusetts. We don't feel this is right as colonists. You jerk. Remove the coercive laws. Get rid of the duty on tea," because that one's still there from the Intolerable Acts. Get rid of the Tea Act as well. Go back to the way things were in 1763. You're a jerk, King George. And they're going to write this mean letter and all agree to go back to their colonies and boycott. One other thing they're going to do at this First Continental Congress is they're going to say, "We should meet in a year. We should meet in a year to meet to see how the king responds to things and see how we should react to the king's response." Now, most people think this isn't going to be an issue. They think the king is going to do exactly what Parliament has done in previous after the Stamp Act and after the Townsend duties, and backed off. They think the king's going to back off here too. They think he's going to remove the coercive laws, and he's going to even remove the duty on tea. And they're going to come back, and next year they'll be here in 1775. They'll be partying in Philadelphia because things are back to normal. They think that this is going to be the solution to the problems because it was before. So they leave in 1774. We'll meet a year later, but for now, Steve, you go mail this off to King George, this mean letter, and everybody go tell your people in your colonies, don't buy British goods, don't sell goods to Britain. So they're going to go off and they're going to do this, and basically think they're going to come back in a year. Everything's going to be fine. Everything is not going to be fine. So King George will receive this mean letter from this First Continental Congress. I like to imagine King George sitting in a throne like the Emperor from Return of the Jedi, and he's sitting there, and his aide comes in, and he's, the king's sitting there with the fire going in front of him, and his aide says, Sir, I just got this letter from this First Continental Congress." King George, "Who?" It's a bunch of elites in the colonies, like imagine if it's like Beyonce and Mark Cuban, and King's like, "Well, who? They're just a bunch of elites. Who gave them authorization to form this? I don't know, sir, but But basically, they sent you this letter. King George gets the mean letter the First Continental Congress put together, and he's going to say, I'm a jerk. You demand I get rid of the coercive laws? And he's going to decide, I'm not going to back down to these colonist demands this time. We're through with backing down. And instead, King George is going to read this letter as if basically Massachusetts and Boston in particular is spreading this confrontational attitude. He doesn't view it as the colonists standing up for Boston. He views it as Boston spreading this disease of revolution. And again, even not very many people in favor of revolution, but he thinks this rebellious attitude is spreading. And so the way King George is going to look at this is it almost like Boston and Massachusetts, New England, is a tumor, and it's spreading discontent to the rest of the colonies. So George is going to determine, I've got to end this before it can spread any further. So instead of backing down, he is going to call for this guy. It's a guy named Thomas Gage. He's going to say to Thomas Gage, I'm giving you 4,000 troops. Go to Boston, put a stop to this nonsense. You go there, take these 4,000 people, and make sure that these people of Boston, they can't rebel. Shut them up. Capture anybody that's talking about disobeying the king and jail them. Make sure this doesn't go any further. He picks Thomas Gage. Thomas Gage, and I feel I should say this, he's an incredibly reasonable individual. He'd actually lived in the colonies for a long period of time. I think he might have been a royal governor for a while. He was married, I believe, to a woman from the colonies. He knew colonists. He was friends with them. I feel I have to say this because in certain movies and like the History Channel, he's portrayed as like, I'm evil, I'm going to kill these colonists. That's not what he's out there to do. He basically is told by the king, stop this revolution, capture these revolutionary figures, and get this area of Boston quiet before this sort of attitude can spread. And he's going to go there and he's going to be a fairly reasonable dude in doing it. He's not going to be, a horrible figure or anything, like a conniving evil person. He's just being sent there to suppress a revolution. Well, Gage and his 4,000 men will arrive in Boston in 1774, and he and his 4,000 men will start occupying the city. And what they're going to do is they're going to start trying to root out those who've been pushing this discontent, those who had been organizing things like the protests before the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party. Find those guys, arrest them, and prevent this thing from turning into a revolution. So Gage is going to get to Boston. One of the first things he's going to do is first seek out these various leaders to arrest them, and he's also going to want to prevent if these guys, and again, it's a small percentage, although in Massachusetts the number's growing, but there is some people talking about independence. He wants to make sure that group, if it decides to act, it's going to be squashed quickly. So what this means is taking their weapons to prevent any revolution from, going much beyond the starting phase. If you decide to revolt against the king, you're not going to be very effective if you don't have guns to fight with. So what Gage, one of his first acts is going to be to send 1,000 soldiers on the night of April 18th to seize some these officials or these residents of Massachusetts that have been talking about independence. He wants to arrest them in Concord, and he wants to seize the guns from this arsenal in Concord. So basically, there were arsenals throughout the colonies. What this would be is if there was an Indian attack, which there hadn't been in a while, or if there was a French invasion whenever the French were a threat, what would happen is the colonial militia would assemble, they would meet in an arsenal, and they would get guns. Most of these colonies have guns, but these would be military-grade guns, and they'd get cannons, and then you'd head off to fight Indians or fight the French. So this is just a place to store weapons if a militia is needed. Well, Gage is going to look at the situation. These guys could potentially use these guns against us, the British. We don't want that to happen, so I'm going to send my soldiers to seize the weapons from Concord. And I've heard some of these guys that are spreading this revolutionary discontent are in Concord, so I'm going to send my dudes to arrest them. Well, Gage doesn't want, the people of Concord to learn he's sending his men. So what he's going to decide to do is send the men the night of April 18th. They're going to march at night, arrive in Concord in the morning, catch the revolutionary leaders, basically when they're in bed before they can learn they're coming, and seize the weapons before the people of Concord can hide them. So Gage is going to order 1,000 of his 4,000 troops towards Concord. Gage actually remains behind in Boston, just sends a trusted officer in charge of the 1,000 men, and he thinks it's going to be a simple operation. This isn't going to upset anybody. I mean, people aren't going to like that I seize the guns, but it's not. He doesn't think this is going to be anything major. Just send the men, seize the weapons, come back the next day. All right, so these 1,000 troops, they tell them sleep during the day. We're going to head off the night of April 18th. Well, the soldiers head out of Boston April 18th. Some people are going to notice these soldiers leaving, and they're going to realize they're heading towards Concord. And some of these pro-independence guys are going to decide to warn the people of Concord to hide the weapons, warn the revolutionary leaders to escape before the British soldiers can get there. One of the people that learns the British are marching towards Concord is a guy named Paul Revere. Paul Revere is silversmith. He's one of these guys that's pro-independence, again, minority of the population at this point, about to get to majority, but he's one of these guys that had been saying it doesn't make sense for us to stay with Britain. We should be independent. And he sees the British troops marching out, and he's going to go decide to warn the people of Concord. Before we talk about what he does he look like somebody? I personally think he looks exactly like Jack Black. I could be wrong, but anyway, just know that Paul Revere is going to head out as a British are marching towards Concord. And what he's going to decide to do is to tell other pro-independence people on the way that, hey, we need to slow the British down and we need to reach Concord, have them hide the weapons. Again, they don't. If you're one of the guys in favor of independence, you realize that them seizing the guns is going to hurt your efforts. So Paul Revere will head out, and he's going to start going by as he goes these pro-independence guys' houses and saying, what does he say? Does he say, the British are coming, the British are coming? Does not say that. He almost certainly does not say that. Why would that make no sense? Because all the colonists are British. So, that would be, the British are coming. Somebody sees you. I see you, Paul. We're all British. I see you arriving. At the time, it'd be like, Paul Revere, I'm eating a sandwich. You're just announcing something that you're doing. He almost certainly didn't say that. What he probably said is, the regulars are coming. Regulars meaning professional military. If he said anything like that at all, he probably said the regulars are coming, and warned the various people to, gather your guns. If you're pro-independence, we need to slow these guys down. That's more than likely what he said. So that's probably a myth about Paul Revere, is that he said the British are coming. Another thing is probably a myth about Paul Revere is that, or that is a myth about Paul Revere, is that he's not actually going to reach Concord to warn the people there of the British. He doesn't get all the way. He only makes it part of the way between Boston and Concord. He's not going to make it, but he is going to pick up two other guys on his way. It's one of them that will actually make it. On his way, he's going to pick up a guy named Samuel Dawes. You don't need to know Samuel Dawes. He's not gonna make it to Concord either. But he is going to pick up a third guy named Samuel Prescott, another pro-independence guy. Prescott's actually going to be the one to make it to Concord to warn them to hide the weapons, to get the people the British are coming to arrest, to get them to escape. He makes it, not Paul Revere. Why don't we talk about? And as a matter of fact, Paul Revere will get arrested by the British on the way, or detained by the British on the way. What happens is Revere's riding along. He meets Samuel Dawes. Hey, come with me. We need to go warn people. We need to go to Concord. They meet up with Samuel Prescott later. And as they're riding in the middle of the night, a British patrol that had been set ahead of the 1,000 soldiers stops Dawes, Prescott, and Revere. And the British patrol, what are you guys doing? Paul Revere stops like, oh, shoot, dude. And he actually will get detained. Dawes and Prescott, they ride away. Samuel Dawes, I believe he falls off his horse, hurts his ankle. He's not able to go any further. Revere actually tells him what he was up to, the British soldiers. Like, he kind of thinks it doesn't matter because, I've warned enough people anyway. But Prescott rides away from the British. He gets to Concord. He's the one that tells them about the 1,000 soldiers on the way. Why don't we hear about him instead? Why do we hear about Paul Revere, who made it halfway and then was essentially caught? I think it has to do with this poem in the that was in the mid 1800s. A guy named Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote a poem called Paul Revere's Ride, and he essentially was looking for somebody with other fame, and Paul Revere is more famous for other things he did in Boston. So I'm picking somebody that's semi-famous already. And he's also going to say Revere rhymes with a lot cooler words than Dawes or Prescott. So it rhymes with severe and fear and these other cool sounding words. So he picked Paul Revere because of that. This poem becomes famous in the mid 1800s, well after the U.S. gets its independence. And, because people don't have enough to entertain themselves, the poem becomes like this huge deal. And then when people learn it, they learn about Paul Revere instead of Samuel Prescott. So I think that's part of the reason that we know Paul Revere instead of Samuel Prescott. I think the other reason is that Paul Revere actually picks up Samuel Prescott to ride with him middle of the night when Samuel Prescott was, and this is a quote, coming home from a girlfriend's at a most unusual hour. So Samuel Prescott joined Paul Revere in his ride to Concord while he was on a booty call. So we know what you were up to, Samuel Prescott, and unfortunately because of that, history doesn't remember you, but we do now. So anyway, Samuel Prescott makes it to Concord, and he's going to warn them, the people at Concord, that the British are on their way, or the British regulars are on their way. Well, as Prescott's riding to Concord, the British are going to be marching through the night. They're going to reach this place a little bit more than halfway between Boston and Concord called Lexington. Lexington is this location where Revere and then later Dawes and Prescott, all these militiamen that had been warned by them, they had decided to meet at Lexington. This is going to be where they're going to slow the British Army down to allow the people of Concord to get the weapons away to escape if they're revolutionary sympathizers. And the people of Lexington, again, these are just these pro-independence guys, are going to arrive at Lexington. They're going to start filtering in throughout the night. Hey, when the British come, we're going to kick their butts. They're talking about we're going to stop them, we're going to slow them down. But they get there well before the British arrive, and they're going to sort of look around. This is just Joe Schmo farmer with a gun. Well, they should be here soon. What are we going to do till then? Hey, there's a bar over here. These guys start going to a bar. They start boozing it up like, dude, when the British get here, I'm gonna kick their ass, and they start drinking and everything, and they start getting beer muscles, all right? These are just farmers. The British soldiers are professional soldiers. They're tough. They know how to fight. But these militiamen, they're going to line up when the British start approaching, again, probably hiccuping and stumbling everywhere, like cartoony drunk style. And when the British pull up, they're going to say to the militiamen in front of them, "Good sirs, move out of our way," probably being all polite and doing so. But the colonists are going to say, screw you, British soldier guy. And they're going to refuse to get out of the way. Well, there's this face-off. We don't know exactly what happens. There's a couple different accounts. But what we probably think happens is that maybe a drunken militiaman, maybe a guy who's in the outhouse over here, puking or whatever, and like he's stumbling out of the outhouse, like, what's going on here, guys? What's going on here? Trips and fires a gun. And when he fires a gun, the British are going to say, "Oh, we're getting fired at." Level their weapons and fire into the militia crowd, killing 8 militiamen. We don't know if it's a guy coming out of an outhouse, but we do think it's a militiaman, probably a drunken guy, fires a gun. When the firing starts, the British, being trained soldiers, professionals, are going to fire into this crowd, killing 8 of the gathered militiamen, and then marching past on towards Concord. Now, here's the thing about this encounter at Lexington. When this happens, almost, I shouldn't say that, a good chunk of those who are pushing for independence are sitting here lined up. They now lose 8 of their number. Well, these guys are going to run back home, and they're going to be saying, this guy right here goes into his cousin's house and says, "Holy crap, They just killed 8 more of us. They killed 8 at the Boston Massacre. They just killed cousin Steve. Well, he runs to his cousin, uncle, dad's house, or whoever. Maybe they didn't care one way or another about independence. They're that's ridiculous. Let's just whatever pay off the coercive laws. Let's deal with it and let's stay with them. But now their son's dead, their cousin's dead, their friend's dead. The British have killed 8 more people, and this is going to get a lot of people throughout the area who are on the fence about independence saying, that's it, we can't deal with this any longer. And we're going to see a lot of these guys start grabbing their guns and joining with those pro-independence people. We'll see them again in just a second. So the British, soldiers are going to march past Lexington and arrive in Concord a little bit before noon on April 19th. When they get there, they're going to find, because of Samuel Prescott, the people they had came to arrest, they'd already fled. All the guns had been taken out of the arsenal. They'd been buried somewhere else. And so the British arrive here. There's nothing here. Everything we were sent to get is gone. So what do we do now? Well, the commander of the 1,000 British soldiers is going to decide to turn around and march back to Boston. And if you're a British soldier, you've been marching for, 13, 14 hours, something like that at this point. Now you're going to have to be marching another 10, 12, 13, 14 hours, something like that on the way back. So these British soldiers are going to turn back, exhausted and tired, head back from Concord. Well, almost as soon as they're leaving Concord, they're going to start running into these colonists that have armed themselves and are going to start firing back at the British soldiers. So when Bill ran from Lexington, told his dad about what had happened, maybe, hey, my brother Tom got killed. Dad, again, didn't care about independence. Now his son's killed. He's now grabbed a gun, and as the British are marching back from Concord, he's going to take a pot shot at them, kill one of them. And then, Steve over here didn't care about independence before. Now he's on board because his cousin Tom had gotten killed. He's going to fire in the British crowd, the crowd of soldiers. And what we're going to see as the British are marching back, they're going to be confronted by these colonists, these just farmers, carpenters, blacksmiths. They're going to start popping up, taking shots at them, and the British are going to be unable to respond or not know how to respond to these attacks. So the British are trained in this military warfare where you basically face off against your opponent, fire at them. And these colonists are going to be fighting like a traditional battle. They're going to be shooting from behind a fence. By the time the British commander turn, aim, they fire at the fence, this guy's already halfway down the road preparing to shoot at him again. And what's going to happen is the 1,000 British soldiers are going to start being picked off as they make their way from Concord to back to Boston. 300 of them will fall to the American soldiers, more than 300. This depiction is a little inaccurate because it shows this guy in a uniform. They're not in uniforms. They're just dudes who now are turning on the British, firing back at them. And these forces get picked off as they head back from Concord to Boston. The survivors are going to make it back, I believe at the end of April 19th, sort of the night of April 19th. They're going to meet with Thomas Gage. Gage is going to be like, where's the 30 you guys are gone? What the hell happened? Sir, we kind of didn't get the weapons. What are you talking about? I just sent you to get weapons, arrest a couple people. And we kind of killed a couple people and then turned the countryside against us. And what Gage is now going to be faced with is word will start spreading throughout this area that the British have now killed people, and now people are fighting them. And anybody that was pro-independence from the surrounding area is going to start grabbing their guns and descending on Boston. So you have the remaining 3,600 or so British troops here in Boston. Now, Thomas Gage back in charge. Well, all these colonists that are in favor of independence, which more are going to be so after Lexington, will start surrounding Boston. And what this is going to mean is that Gage is going to be trapped in Boston with his 4,000 soldiers. So 15,000 or so colonial militiamen will start arriving. And again, this is just Joe Schmo in favor of independence. will start showing up here. They'll start showing up here, and they're going to trap these British soldiers. Some will go down on this little peninsula right here, and they're going to trap Gage and his troops in Boston. Now, Gage and his troops are going to have support from the sea, but the colonists are going to be able to fire at these British troops as they soldiers as they come in, because they're going to take up these positions around here. Now, Gage can't break out by land because basically these areas that go into Boston are going to be well covered by this colonial militia. If the 3,600 are going to try to go out this way, they'll start taking fire from these colonists. So think about what happens at Lexington and Concord as rallying people, turning people that are on the fence about independence towards independence, and it's going to lead all these guys to surround Boston and trap Gage and his remaining troops here. Well, this is going to be the situation April, May, June, and what Gage is going to decide in June is basically, I've got to break this siege of Boston. I'm trapped here. Hypothetically, I could get on a ship, go out of here. The problem with getting on ships and even getting supplies is the best place to bring the best water to bring stuff in is this direction. And ships get fired on by colonists who have taken up this position on this Breed's Hill right here. So ships going into Boston are subject to fire by colonists. And even supposedly some of these colonists can fire into Boston itself. So the British are trapped in here. And by the way, some just regular Boston citizens are trapped in this area as well. But Gage has got to decide, I've got to get out of here. I've got to break this siege. Instead of stopping this revolution, I've almost started this revolution. And so what Gage is going to decide to do on June 17th, 1775, is he's going to decide, I can break the siege by first taking this peninsula and taking these colonists out that had taken position on this Breed's Hill right here, this Breed's Hill where they're firing cannons at my ships and my men. So on June 17th, 1775, so would this be 2 months after 2 months after Lexington and Concord, the Gage will send his soldiers over in these boats to remove the colonists here on Breed's Hill. The thinking, we take them out here, and then maybe we can proceed down here and then break the siege by taking the colonists out in this direction. So he starts sending his remaining soldiers over in these boats to take out these colonists on Breed's Hill. Well, the British soldiers are going to land, and they're going to start proceeding up here to take on the colonists. Well, the British soldiers are going to be marching uphill. So this would be at the beginning of this battle of Breed's Hill. The British, they land their men. They start proceeding upwards. They got a problem because they're moving uphill. The colonists are firing down on the British, so they're able to get better sight lines, just weapons, better firing downhill than they are uphill. So as the British march up, they're going to face off with these colonists using cannons. Some of them grabbed from the arsenals at Concord that have been hidden because of Samuel Prescott, and they're going to start firing down at the British lines. Some of the cannons are filled with chopped up horseshoe bits, like firing at the British soldiers like cannonballs. And as the British march up, they're going to start getting mowed down, one line after another, one line after another, one line after another, as they march up. And as a matter of fact, the British march up on multiple instances to try to take this hill. This is a fun gif of what happened. So these are the British troops that are landing. This is the position on Breed's Hill. British soldiers, hey, we're going to take this. We're going to take this. Oh, crap, that hurts. All right, guys, we're really going to take it this time. Oh, dude, that really hurts. All right, this dude's coming. We're going to take it this time. Eventually, the British will take Breed's Hill, and they're going to take this follow-up colonial position at Bunker Hill. But this is going to be incredibly costly. So technically, the British are going to win the Battle of Breed's Hill, or later on it's going to earn the name Bunker Hill because somebody mislabeled the hill and people started calling it the Battle of Bunker Hill mistakenly. Even though they take the hill, it's sort of a Pyrrhic victory. You'll sometimes hear Pyrrhic. I've also heard it pronounced Pyrrhic victory. But I've heard a couple different pronunciations. But what this is they win, but it costs the British a lot. As a matter of fact, the British are going to lose 1,000 men in taking the hill. So you take the position, but you lose 1,000 guys. The Americans the colonists are only going to lose I think it's 114, give or take a couple, and taking this hill. So you lose 10 times as many men. And the thing is, this isn't going to be a huge strategic victory because the British take this area. The colonists are just going to take up position at the top of the peninsula anyway, and the British aren't going to be able to break the siege. So, sure, you take this, but you can't get past this region anyway. So Gage just loses 1,000 men for almost nothing. Again, this Battle of Breed's Hill, or as we know it today, Bunker Hill, this is going to be incredibly bloody, and it's going to be incredibly bloody on the side of the British. As a matter of fact, Thomas Gage loses his job immediately after this. They put a guy, an officer that had been under him, a guy named William Howe, in charge of British forces in Boston. Shortly thereafter, Gage, you're doing a terrible job. You're fired. Again, the British can't break out of Boston still. Kind of an interesting thing that's going to come out of this Battle of Bunker Hill is some of the people that are going to participate on it on the colonist side. So this is, again, farmers, carpenters fighting over here. Some of the people that participate in it are actually slaves. So as we've talked about before, slaves only make up a small percentage of the New England population, whether it be the fact that cash crops can't grow up there, Puritanism looking down on people who keep slaves. Very small percentage of the population, but it's still present. It's not economically important here in New England, but some of these slaves will be serving alongside their masters. As a matter of fact, a couple of these slaves are going to serve heroically in the Battle of Bunker Hill. You see one depicted right here, fighting alongside his master. Well, after this happens, New England, Boston, particularly hopped up on Enlightenment literature, and a lot of the Enlightenment talks about things like all men created equal. You can't have divine right to rule because God didn't ordain, men with certain rights. He gave all men equal rights. Some of these people that are hopped up in this Enlightenment literature are going to say, hey, these guys fought just as well as us. Where Enlightenment literature basically saying all men are created equal. We're now fighting the Britain because we think they're oppressing us. Is this slavery justified? And we'll see almost immediately after the Battle of Bunker Hill, Breed's Hill, this push towards giving slaves their freedom. And a lot of times what's going to happen here in New England, and we'll see this eventually throughout these northern colonies where slavery is not economically important, is they'll offer slaves their freedom if they fight with colonial militias. Like, okay, if you fight for a period of time with the colonial militia, and eventually when we form the Continental Army, if you fight with the Continental Army, you'll get your freedom at the end of this thing. So again, I don't want to put this all entirely on this battle, but this is going to start getting people to free their slaves, at least a part of the way to free their slaves. All right, so this happens, this craziness. We now have fighting first at Lexington, then at Concord. Now this Battle of Bunker Hill. This all happens, again, April to June 1775. It happens right at the same time as those delegates are meeting for that Second Continental Congress. Again, they met a year before and said, let's meet up in a year. We're sure we're going to high-five. We're going to party in Philadelphia because the king's going to back down. Instead, they show up for this Second Continental Congress, and it's going to be in there from May 1775 to July 1775. They're going to show up as this stuff starts happening in Boston, and they're going to be, holy S, what the hell are you guys doing up there, Boston? They basically thought they're going to be arriving to things being okay. Instead, it looks like there's a war in New England. So these guys are going to be sitting there. How the hell do we respond to that? This is insane. There's fighting up there in New England. Well, there's going to be a lot of decisions. At this point, there hadn't been much going on in the southern colonies. Again, all these people showing up, they don't like, they didn't like the Stamp Act. They didn't like the Townsend duties. They didn't agree with the coercive laws in Boston. But, they're not being particularly affected. And even these middle colonies aren't being particularly affected either. And so, these guys, they're still, the idea of independence is still foreign to them. And basically, you're going to get at this meeting people in Massachusetts, some of those from neighboring colonies, they're going to say, We've got to fight. We're up there. We're fighting. We're now dying. We've now got them under siege in Boston. You need to join us. We need to do something about this. But these other colonies are going to say, dude, this is crazy. This is going too far. And a lot of these guys are going to say, fighting is insane. Why would these guys in particular be very hesitant to fight Britain? Well, one, because they know if they're the ones to push for independence, the British are going to come after them. They're going to be the ones who are going to be arrested, maybe even killed by this. These guys are wealthy. They know if they fight Britain, there goes my money for a long time. If there's a fight here, we don't have a navy. We have a couple people that might join us to fight for independence that are fishermen. We might have a couple boats on our side. That's not going to stop the British Navy. So essentially, all ports will shut down during the course of whatever this fighting is. And so any business is done during this time. So these elites, they're going to lose a lot of money, and they may lose their lives. And even if they, setting that stuff aside, this is effing Britain. This is the most powerful navy in the world, second most powerful in the army in the world besides France. If you fight them, what are the chances you're actually going to win? So at this Second Continental Congress, some people are going to be pushing for war and independence. Most are still going to be hesitant to do that. And for this reason, one of the first things the Second Continental Congress is going to do is write something called the Olive Branch Petition. So whereas the First Continental Congress said, King George, you're a jerk, we demand you go back to the way things were in 1763, the Olive Branch Petition, and if you know olive branch, it's sort of a sign of peace. Olive Branch Petition will say, hey, George, looking trim, what are you on a diet? You're looking so good. So buddy, pal, friend, we're best buddies. Can we please have peace here? We don't want to fight. We really don't want to fight, but we really don't like what you're doing up in Boston. We'd like you to remove your soldiers from there, and we'd like to go back to the way things were in 1763. Forget these extra duties. Get rid of the duty on tea. Let us run things ourselves. We'll continue to pay the standard duties we were paying in 1763. We're best of buddies. We were best of buddies then, and we can still be best of buddies. Please, George. Again, you're so handsome. So they write this Olive Branch Petition asking for peace. So they ask for peace, but these guys are going to make another decision. If the king doesn't accept this, all these elites, and by the way, again, I need to remind you, this isn't people that are, have any degree of authority. It's just people that are wealthy individuals from each of the colonies. They're going to be making decisions for the colonies, even though they're just dudes, from these various colonies. They're going to decide, we need to prepare in case the king rejects this Olive Branch Petition. If he does, we're not going to let Massachusetts fall. So, hey, Virginia, hey, South Carolina, I know you guys think the idea of independence is ridiculous, although Virginia is kind of on board with it, but South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, you guys are hesitant for independence. You really are. And I understand, because this stuff hasn't been affecting you very much, but we can't let Boston, or we can't let Massachusetts, New England fall, take the brunt of this, because if George does this to them, and then we disagree with something, he's going to march on us. So we need to stand together. I think this actually comes out another time, but you'll hear Benjamin Franklin, who's a representative from Pennsylvania. One of his famous sayings is, we need to hang together or we'll hang alone. So we can't let Massachusetts die by themselves. So we need to prepare in case King George rejects the Olive Branch Petition. So one thing they're going to do is they're going to decide, we need to set up a colonial government. We need to act together in concert, and we need to make military decisions for us together. So we should appoint a colonial government. Let's basically make it ourselves. We'll stay in session here in Philadelphia, and what we'll do is we'll form an army. If the king rejects us, this colonial capital in Philadelphia will direct the army. Now, we're not talking about what type of government we're going to form just yet, but we need to form a capital just in case. All right, so the Second Continental Congress, we're forming a government, and we're going to form an army. We need an army if we're going to fight the king. We can't just let militiamen, like up there in New England, fight things, because they're not going to stand a chance against a professional army, especially in a straight-on battle. We need to get people to sign up for a period of time, train, and we're going to need, professional military. All right, so we need a professional military. First of all, how are we going to form this military? We got, we don't have any money. Well, we'll raise a little bit of money. Maybe we'll offer some land or something like that for service, but maybe we can get some soldiers that way. So they're going to come up with a couple ways to pay soldiers. But then they're going to say, well, who's going to lead this army? Well, Second Continental Congress, they're going to look around and they're going to say, what about, Joe Josen over there? He's got experience fighting. Yeah, but he fought Indian battles. This is going to be a different type of war. He's not very good. All right, what about George Washington over there, one of the representatives from Virginia? Dude, he sucks, man. Did you hear what happened to him in the 7 Years' War? He got his butt kicked by the French a couple times. We don't want him. What about Tom Thompson? Again, Indian fighter. Oh, what about that guy? He's not here, but Steve Stevenson. Dude, he's with the British. He's not on board with this kind of stuff. He's not going to join us. Well, crap. Who can we pick? Well, the Second Continental Congress is going to look back to this George Washington dude from Virginia, and they're going to decide we're got to pick him, okay? One reason is he's one of the few at the convention with experience fighting European armies. The other reason is he's Virginian, okay? So he's one of the few that's fought a European army before. He knows European-style tactics. And then he's Virginian. Why would Virginian matter to the Second Continental Congress? Well, it's going to matter because at this point, most of the fighting's up in New England. If you look down south at Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, a lot of those people aren't on board with this. And even though the elites understand, hey, we need to defend Massachusetts, Joe Schmo might not. By appointing Washington as your general, this tells South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, this is an all of us thing. This isn't just a New England thing. This isn't just a Massachusetts thing. And you can see that because the head of this thing is going to be a guy from Virginia. Virginia, by the way, is the biggest state, population and size-wise, at the time. So this gets Virginia on board, and in general, it'll get Southerners on board because they'll see this as a all of us thing instead of just a Northern thing. All right, so if we go to war, we got Washington, and he'll be our guy. Okay, so if we get into this thing, we're going to need help. Who can we get help from? Well, they're going to look north to French in Canada. Again, since the end of the 7 Years' War, the French had been occupied by the British soldiers, and even after the French were defeated, there's still French citizens in Canada. A lot of these the elites from these 13 colonies are going to say, we can make that our 14th colony. The French don't like being under British rule. We can have them join us. At the end of this thing, maybe they'll get their independence, or maybe they'll join with us as a 14th colony, hopefully as a 14th colony. But they're not present at the Second Continental Congress, but we need to get them on board, and I'm sure they'll get on board as long as we we send somebody, an ambassador, to speak with them. And not just the French Canadians, but France itself. France and Britain are constantly getting in wars. France just lost this last one. They'd like a chance to get some of their territory back. So we need somebody to go speak to France. So they're going to send Benjamin Franklin first to meet with the French Canadians, then to France to try to get those guys on board. They're also going to send another delegate to Spain. Hey, Spain, you lost Florida. You can get this back by fighting with us. And they're going to send ambassadors to major European nations. So they're going to decide to send delegates to, in case the war starts. All right, well, these guys meet. They are going to stay in session in Philadelphia. Ben Franklin's going to head off to Canada. George Washington will head off to take control of forces in around Boston. But before anything's acted, they got to see how the king responds to this. So they send off the Olive Branch Petition. And again, most of these colonists are crossing their fingers that the king says, no war, I'm going to back off the Coercive Laws, go back to the way things were in 1763. Instead, King George, again, sitting on his emperor's throne, his aide's going to come in and say, King, I got another letter from this Second Continental Congress. It's a new one, but they basically want to talk to you about peace and things like that. And King George is going to say, I don't even want to see it. And he's going to essentially rip up the olive branch petition. Supposedly he didn't even read it, tosses it in the fire, and says, we are at war. This isn't going to work. We're at war. I'm not listening to any overtures towards peace. So he tosses that in the trash, and now we've got war. Well, colonists learn what the king has said, and now they're going to have to prepare to fight. Well, George Washington gets all in his military gear. He's going to now have to start assembling this army, this professional army, where there had been no professional army before. So he's immediately going to head to Boston. He's going to head to Boston, where these militia had started gathering, or had been laying siege to the British in Boston. And Washington's going to show up with the intention of forming a professional army. And again, what other better place to do it than a place where men under arms are already gathered and people that are already on board with independence are gathered. So he shows up here outside of Boston, and he's going to try to get people to sign these terms of enlistment for money or promises of land, things like that. He arrives outside of Boston, and he's going to find it very difficult to get people to sign enlistments around Boston. Why would Washington find it difficult to recruit the people laying siege to Boston? Well, he's going to find it difficult because these guys are depicted in uniforms. That's probably not the case in reality. But these guys who had been laying siege, they're militia, meaning that essentially they're there voluntarily. Maybe they made an agreement with a local militia unit or something like that. But if things start going poorly, they can take off. If it's time to pick the crops, they can go home and pick the crops. If it's time to plant the crops, they can leave. If they disagree with their commanding officer, they can leave. What Washington's asking these guys to do is to sign their life over for a year enlistment, 2-year enlistment, depends on the amount of time. And during this time, they can't leave. They're under contract. And basically, if they leave, then they can be in prison, thrown in jail, something like that. So he wants them to sign contracts. A lot of these guys are going to say, I don't like the British and I want to defeat them, but I don't want to be a member of the professional military. So Washington's going to have this difficult time recruiting men. Eventually, he's going to get some of these guys to sign the professional army. And we'll see during late 1775, Washington will start training his professional army outside of Boston as the British are sort of just chilling in Boston because they can't really go anywhere. Well, Washington recruiting men is not going to be, and by the way, another reason it has difficult recruiting men is because, wait, who sent you? Second Continental Congress. Wait, who the hell are they? Oh, we're just a bunch of elites. We came together. We're deciding we're going to be running this thing. Well, who let you decide that? So he's not appointed by anything official, just this Second Continental Congress, which is dudes. So, and then the fact he's a Virginian, like a lot of these people up here, well, get in your car and get out of here. I can't do a Boston accent, but here's a Virginian trying to tell these guys up here what to do. That's kind of difficult. But eventually he is going to get people to join his army. But even after he gets people to join his army, he's going to find a lot of problems controlling his men. And he actually finds a lot of problems controlling his men because while he's laying siege to Boston, there's going to be a lot of anti-Catholicism, okay? So one of the things that Virginia by this point, religion's sort of been pushed to the side. I don't want to say completely, but they don't care if you're Catholic. As a matter of fact, Maryland, just north of this area, made up of a good percentage is Catholic. They don't necessarily care as much about religion down in the South as they do up here in the Northeast. Again, as we talked about, the ardent Puritanism has died down significantly. It's actually died down so significantly that there's a prostitution district in Boston, and this is a map drawn by a British officer at the time. You see this Mount Whoredom. This is the area of the red light district of Boston. So that shows how the Puritanism has died down significantly, but there still is an anti-Catholicism left over from that Puritanism. Again, some aspects of the Puritanism had died down, but others remained, and anti-Catholicism was strong. Well, when Washington's here, he's going to be, again, wanting to make this a colony-wide thing, and he knows other colonies have Catholics, so he doesn't want his troops to demonstrate anti-Catholicism, and he has an especially difficult time because while he's there, his men run off one night to celebrate Kill the Pope Day. In Massachusetts, Boston in particular, they would have an annual celebration where somebody would dress like the Pope and they would throw crap at him, like because they don't like Catholics. Again, this Puritan origins, and Washington's got to be, dude, stop this crap. Hey, we're trying to, set aside religion and make this an English colony thing. This is no good. And in particular, Washington wants to cut this out because right at the same time that he's laying siege to Boston, Ben Franklin's up there with the French Canadians trying to convince them to join this thing. And the French Canadians are going to be sitting here looking at a map, and if you look right south of them, these guys, the British had respected their Catholicism since taking over this area since the end of the 7 Years' War. The British soldiers again occupying Montreal, Quebec. But these guys have looked just to the south and said, boy, these guys are really anti-Catholic. And they're going to get this lesson again at the end of 1775 as Washington is unable to prevent his men from celebrating Kill the Pope Day. So this makes it difficult when Ben Franklin goes up to French Canada and says, hey, you guys want to come on board and be the 14th colony? The French Canadians, they're occupied by British soldiers. They're British soldiers in French cities. So if they were getting on board, they'd have to fight the British. They're going to look down at this anti-Catholicism and they're going to say, maybe we'd be on board, but we're nervous about those guys. And they're also nervous because the British have allowed them to have their Catholicism, and they'd actually drawn a line, saying that these other colonies can't move in this French land. And so the French and Canada are like, these guys are protecting us, and they're kind of protecting us from you guys. We might be on board with independence, but we're also a little bit nervous about it. So Franklin's unable to get the French Canadians on board. George Washington tries to encourage them to get on board. He sends one of his trusted officers, a guy named Benedict Arnold, to sends an army up here to try and get rid of the British soldiers in Canada. And basically the thought is that, you take some troops, Arnold, up here, you surround these French Canadian cities, the people will rise up in the cities, then we liberate them. But Benedict Arnold gets up here, winter 1775. French Canadians don't rise up because, again, they say the British have treated us fairly. So Benedict Arnold just starts freezing here, and he's going to make his way down in 1776. These guys don't seem like they're coming on board as this 14th colony. So that's sort of a thing that's going to go against Washington. But one thing that will go for Washington is that in March 1776, the British are going to determine that we can't hold Boston. We need to regroup. And so in March 1776, the British are going to get on their ships. They're going to leave Boston, allowing Washington to enter the city with his army, and these other militias enter with them. So we have this city liberated from the British. Now, again, some people are going to look at a map, and at this point, the only redcoats in North America are these handful up in Canada, a handful of these forts over here, a couple of forts down here. But the only redcoats, there aren't any redcoats in these 13 colonies. So when Washington marches in here, some people are going to say, well, shit, we got our independence. This is it. This is over. Well, as we all know, this isn't over, because all that is happening is that the British have gone off to regroup, and we're going to see them launch another attack in 1776 and it's going to return to war.